Short position calculations. Okay, before I discuss the calculations for short positions, I just want to explain exactly what short selling is. Now, when an investor sells stock short, the investor is going to attempt to buy low and sell high, just like they always do. They just do it in the reverse order. And the easiest way to think of selling stock short is to think of it as two complete transactions, not one, but two. Now, the first transaction is simply borrowing stock from a firm and then replacing it back to the firm at a later time, and that's going to complete the first transaction. The second complete transaction is the actual buying and selling of the stock. Now, the complete cycle would look something like this. An investor identifies a stock that he believes is overvalued and is going to be heading lower. So he borrows the stock from his brokerage firm. He sells the stock drops, and the investor buys it back at the lower price, which locks in the profit. Now, to complete the cycle, the investor then returns the borrowed stock back to the brokerage firm. Now, as we saw with long margin accounts, in a short margin account, there's also an initial margin requirement and a maintenance margin requirement. Now, in the initial amount that can be borrowed is equal to 50% for short accounts, and the customer can meet the initial requirement by depositing cash or securities with a market value of 2 times that initial requirement. The maintenance requirement is going to be 30% for short positions. So it's 50 and 30. With a long margin account, it was 50 and 25. With a short margin account, it's 50% initial and 30% for the maintenance requirement. Now, the equation for initial margin regarding short positions, the calculation is credit equals short market value plus equity. So I'll give you the same exact example that we've been working with. Let's assume that an investor sells short 1,000 shares of stock, trading at a price of $30. Now, the initial requirement would be the credit would equal $45,000 equals a $30,000 short market value plus $15,000 equity. Now, in this example, the investor has a credit in his account of $45,000. This is comprised of the $30,000 worth of stock that he borrowed from the brokerage firm and his deposit of $15,000. Now, note that his deposit was $15,000, and this results in an equity amount of $15,000. Now, as the market value of the securities decreases, the equity in the account will increase. And if the short market value of the securities increases, the equity in the account will decrease. We'll look at both examples. Okay, to reiterate, the investor sold stock 1,000 shares out of a stock trading at $30 per share. He brought in his initial equity requirement, $15,000. So we've got a credit of $45,000 comprised of a short market value of $30,000 plus equity of $15,000. Now, if the short market value increases to $40,000, the equity in the account will decrease down to $5,000. Our equation would look like a credit of $45,000 comprised of a $40,000 market value plus $5,000 equity. Now, in this example, the maintenance requirement would be 30% of the short market value, which is now $40,000. Therefore, our equity of $5,000 is well below the $12,000 maintenance that would be required. So funds or securities would need to be deposited to bring the equity in the account back up to an appropriate level. All right, market value decrease. Now let's say the short market value decreases from $30,000 down to $20,000. The equity in the account is going to increase, as can be seen by the illustration in the book. Therefore, our credit of $45,000 is now comprised of a short market value of $20,000 plus our equity that is now increased to $25,000. Now, as the short market value decreases, the equity in the account will increase, and this will create excess equity. So how do we find the excess equity in a short account? We simply compare the 50% requirement and the current equity. So as you can see in the illustration in the book, we've got a credit of $45,000 in the account. It's comprised of a $20,000 short market value plus $25,000 of equity. So if we simply take 50% of the short market value, we're going to arrive at $10,000. If you subtract that $10,000 from the $25,000 equity in the account, it's going to show us that we have $15,000 in excess equity. That excess equity will be credited to the SMA account. Now, if an investor has both long and short positions in their margin account, we need to find the equity in the account, and we're going to use the following calculation. Long market value plus credit minus debit minus short market value. So for example, let's assume that an investor has a margin account with a long market value of $60,000, a credit balance of $20,000, a debit balance of $30,000, and a short market value of $10,000. His equity would be arrived at by taking $60,000 plus $20,000 minus $30,000 minus $10,000 for an equity amount of $40,000. Now here are a few additional concepts to understand for the margin section. Newly issued securities. Newly issued securities become marginable after a 30-day holding period. That's a hard and fast rule, and it's easily remembered. Newly issued securities become marginable after a 30-day holding period. Pattern day traders. Now, a customer that transacts 4 or more day trades over a 5-day period is considered to be a pattern day trader. I think of this as 4 over 5. Now, a pattern day trader must meet the equity requirement of $25,000 before they engage in any day trading activity, and that same amount, $25,000, must remain in the trader's account for 2 business days following the activity. Shorting of low-price securities. Now, if the price of a security is less than $5 per share, equity is required to be the greater of the market value or $2.50 per share. If the price is $5 or more per share, the required equity is the greater of $5 per share or 30% of the market value. And you can see the illustration in the book. It's very easily memorized as well. Now, when originally establishing a margin account, there is an initial minimum equity required. The minimum initial equity for a margin account, for a long margin account, is going to be the lesser of $2,000 or 100% of the purchase price. Again, this is for long positions, and the rule is the lesser. Lesser with an L, long with an L. For a margin account on a long position, it's going to be the lesser of $2,000 or 100% of the purchase price. Now, for a short account, the minimum initial equity is going to be the greater of $2,000 or the required Reg T requirement. And I'll take you through 5 examples here. Let's start with an initial long example where the investor must deposit $2,000. Now, if we assume an investor's initial transaction is purchasing stock with a market value of $3,800, Reg T requires a $1,900 deposit. This would be 50% of the $3,800. Now remember the rule, it's going to be the lesser of $2,000 or 100% of the purchase price for long positions. So therefore, the investor would have to bring in $2,000. Again, the lesser of $2,000 or 100% of the purchase price, which would be $3,800. Initial long example, 100% of purchase price. Now let's assume an investor's initial transaction is purchasing stock with a market value of $1,900. Now the investor would have to deposit the lesser of $2,000 or 100% of the purchase price. That would be the lesser of $1,900 or $2,000, making the required funds $1,900. Initial long example using Reg T. Now let's assume an investor's initial transaction is purchasing stock with a market value of $8,000. Reg T would require a deposit of $4,000. Okay, let's take a look at short positions. Now the minimum initial equity required for short positions is going to be the greater of $2,000 or the required Reg T requirement. So let's take a look at initial short example, $2,000. Let's assume an investor's initial transaction is selling stock short with a market value of $1,800. Now Reg T requires a $900 deposit. It's 50% of the $1,800. However, remember the investor has to bring in the greater of $2,000 or the Reg T, making the required funds $2,000. Initial short example, Reg T. Let's assume an investor's initial transaction is selling stock short with a market value of $8,000. Reg T would require a $4,000 deposit. That's 50% of the $8,000. Therefore, the investor would have to deposit the greater of $2,000 or $4,000, making the required funds $4,000.